The title of my sermon is Improving Your SWR by Standing Up for Jesus. This thought came as I've been working with radios. I have an FCC license and I know a little bit about radios. It's been kind of a fun hobby for me, and studying SWRs again. SWR is a standing wave ratio. It's the ratio of the power going out versus the power that's reflected back in. So we talk about improving your SWR. Ham radio operators, they talk about having a SWR 1.1 or 1.2, and they brag about that 1.3. So that's a good thing usually, but a really good ham says, it's not all about SWR. There are other things you have to think about too. Last thing about SWR. SWR, standing wave, is a theoretical thing that doesn't quite happen exactly like it does in the theory as it does in the real world. It's a wave that just kind of bounces back and forth. It doesn't go anywhere. A perfect standing wave doesn't go anywhere. It just sits there. Okay, so it sounds kind of funny because an SWR of 1 would sound like something that's absolutely perfect and wonderful. But if you have an SWR 1, then there's likely that nothing's going on. You can actually even take a resistor and a heat sink and hook it up where your antenna goes, and you have a perfect SWR, but you have no signal transmission. Nothing gets out of the radio. There's energy, and all that energy, it just goes to the resistor and it goes away as heat, and nobody gets any information or any energy from that. I don't want to talk too much about science, but I'm going to kind of go back and forth with it. So this SWR, it's an important thing, but it's not really everything. You want the signal to be propagated. That means you want it to leave the antenna and go do what it's intended to do. So that's an important part too. So let's talk about our story a little bit. What does standing waves have to do with what were probably Sadducees, the temple elite, the people that were the chief priests, and they were standing around the temple and they were engaging Jesus in conversation. And they were all the time trying to trip up Jesus. So they wanted to know, what was the authority? By what authority was Jesus doing his wonderful deeds and all the things that he was doing? They were questioning his authority because their authority came from their alliance with Rome and their status as people that would be in control and would be all about the temple. They were the Jewish elite. They were very wealthy, and they had position, and they had even a connection with Rome, and they wanted to know about Jesus. Well, where is your authority coming from? And Jesus, I wish I was as smart as Jesus, maybe once in my life. What does he say? He says, you tell me whether John was from God or from man, and then I will tell you where my authority comes from. So what do? They go, And the thinking processes that no doubt went on in their minds, because they were intelligent people. If we say that John is from God, then Jesus is going to say, well, why didn't you believe him? Why didn't you follow him? And this big upset would happen in the community and all kinds of things. It would destroy their position that they had in Rome with the Roman elite and with their place in the temple. So what do they say? We don't know. What does Jesus say? Well, if you don't answer my question, I'm not going to answer yours. Wow, don't you wish you could do that? I do a lot of times. Anyway, so what is this standing wave ratio? It's kind of one of the ways we can see a wave is, have you ever heard of a wave that people do at a baseball park? When somebody stands up and they lift their arms way up in the air, and then the next person lifts it up, and nothing is really goes from one end of the park to the other, but it looks like this wave that goes there. There's not a ball that's handed from person to person, and it goes all the way down. So the energy is transferred, but there's no matter. There's not substances going by. This wave looks really wonderful when people participate, and it goes from one place in the stadium all the way across, and sometimes even reflects back, and it's kind of a fun thing to watch. I don't suggest you do a wave at a funeral. It's one of those joke things, but if you're maybe at a ballpark, it would be appropriate. So what would a standing wave look like? It would look like maybe 50,000 people. You've got 4 people in the middle of this whole thing, and somebody starts a wave, it goes out about 4, and then it stops because the other person doesn't stand up for Jesus. They don't do the wave in their hands in the air, and it just stops there, and it goes back, and it reflects, and it's caught in that loop forever, just going back and forth. It's a perfect SWR of 1, but it's going nowhere, like that dummy load on an antenna, that all the energy becomes heat, and there's no signal that's propagated. Okay, so a little bit of theory. We can go a little bit further. Well, what does that look like in the real world? What does it look like in the church? Probably not all of us have radio transmitters. We probably all have a radio receiver in our car, or maybe several in our house. But what does this have to do with the church? See, the problem with this is, well, let me just back up a little bit and do a little history, because I like to do some history. There were at least 4 groups of Jewish people during the time of Jesus. They were naturally Jesus' disciples that followed him and propagated the gospel. That's a really good SWR. There were the Pharisees. Jesus' biggest gripe with them is he said, believe what they teach, but don't do what they do. That was a group of Jewish people during Jesus' time that Jesus had difficult too. One of the groups, the Pharisees, his disciples, well, he had trouble with them from time to time too. And then we have the Sadducees. They have that idea that they're the temple and they're in control. And this is a thought too that goes along with, they weren't being changed with Jesus. What they did, if you think back in time, what they did in the Old Testament and teaching the law and teaching the Torah and doing faith and religion the way they've always been taught to, that was a good thing. But guess what happened when somebody stood up and they did the wave and Jesus is here and we need to proclaim that Jesus is here, that Christ is here. And what did they do? They stood in their seats and they didn't raise their hands because they didn't want the reaction from the crowd. They didn't want to lose their place with Rome. They stood there and did nothing. Can you imagine what would have happened if they would have acknowledged that John was from Jesus, that he was sent from God, and that Jesus was the Messiah, and that the religious elite were following them? What a wonderful thing that would have been. But they didn't. They just stood there. So what does this look like in the church? Think about energy. Waves are all about energy. If we can tell what our standing wave is, you think about it, that energy that comes from Christ, the source is wonderful and it's perfect and it's given from God. But what happens? Does it radiate out? Does it propagate like waves? Or does it bounce against the walls in our church and just reflect back and goes nowhere? The heat doesn't transfer outside of our buildings. It goes nowhere. That's a dummy load. That's an SWR of 1. That does absolutely nothing. But to get that energy out, there's a mismatch. There's always a mismatch when you hook up an antenna. No antennas are perfect. But that mismatch causes some energy to reflect back in, causes some warmth and some heat in the church, but the signal gets out. The message gets out. The message would have gotten out if the religious elite, if the chief priest would have acknowledged who John the Baptist was and ultimately that Jesus was the Messiah. The message would have went forth and we would have had a wonderful SWR that started with these Jewish elite, but it didn't happen that way. The other group I didn't talk about that Jesus had trouble with, just throw that in too, were the zealots. Remember, Peter looked like a zealot a little bit because he didn't teach right and not do right. He didn't just follow the old ways and not change and catch up with Jesus. He didn't, well, sometimes he followed Jesus well and sometimes he didn't, but he looked like a zealot when he grabbed the sword and whacked off an ear. So those are some groups of people that maybe we don't want to be just exactly like. Probably closest to the disciples, but they made their mistakes too. But what is our SWR? Is our signal getting out there? Is it being propagated to the world? Are we sending out that message of who Christ is? What's our SWR? You can kind of tell. What our energy and our resources, what do they look like? Are they all about us and propagating who we are? Or is it about the message and the mission of Jesus Christ? Amen.